The nurse called my name twice before I realized she meant me. I was sitting in a small clinic waiting room 30 miles from our farm, the only Amish woman among a row of strangers, and when she finally looked up and asked if anyone was coming with me, I simply said no, it's just me, in a voice that sounded far steadier than I actually felt. I remember the particular strangeness of that waiting room. The bright fluorescent lights, so different from the soft daylight I was used to, the quiet murmur of a television mounted in the corner, my own plain dress feeling suddenly very visible among the modern clothing around me. I sat with my hands folded in my lap the way I had been taught, and waited. I did not think anything of it at the time, but the question the doctor asked me 20 minutes later, in a small quiet exam room, would end up changing more about my life than any single conversation I had ever had. My name is Lavina. I was 23, 6 weeks pregnant with my first child, and completely certain that going to this appointment alone was simply the ordinary, expected thing to do. I need to explain why I was alone, because I do not want you to imagine some dramatic absence on my husband's part. Samuel was not distant or unkind. He was in the middle of harvest, and in our community, a first prenatal appointment was not considered something requiring a husband's presence. Pregnancy itself was treated, quietly and completely, as women's territory, something handled, discussed, and managed almost entirely among mothers, sisters, and midwives, with husbands informed of developments rather than present for them. I had grown up watching this pattern my entire life. My own mother had attended every one of her 8 pregnancies appointments alone. It never once occurred to me that there was another way to do this. I sat in that small exam room, in a paper gown that felt strange against skin more accustomed to plain cotton, and I answered the doctor's questions the way I had prepared myself to answer them. Briefly, practically, the way you would report on a crop yield rather than describe an actual felt experience. And then she asked me something that was not on her usual list of questions. She set down her clipboard, looked at me directly, and asked, gently, "Who is helping you at home?" I remember the quality of silence that followed that question. Not an awkward silence, just a genuinely empty space where an answer should have been, and was not. She waited, patient, her pen resting lightly against the clipboard, giving me time I did not know I needed. I want you to understand why this question stopped me so completely. It was not a complicated question. It was not even, on its surface, a particularly personal one. But I realized, sitting there in that thin paper gown, that I did not have an honest answer prepared. My automatic response, the one that rose immediately to my lips, was simply, "I am managing fine." But she had not asked if I was managing fine. She had asked who was helping me. And the honest answer to that question was no one. Not because anyone had refused to help, because it had never once occurred to me, or to anyone around me, that 6 weeks pregnant while still doing the full physical labor of an Amish household and farm might be something that actually required help at all. Have you ever been asked a question so simple that it exposed instantly an assumption you had never once examined? That is exactly what happened to me in that small room. I had been rising before dawn every single day since discovering I was pregnant, continuing every physical task exactly as I had before. Hauling water, tending the garden, managing laundry for a household of 6. Because slowing down, asking for adjustment, admitting that early pregnancy might actually be physically demanding had never once crossed my mind as something a good Amish wife would do. The doctor did not lecture me. She simply made a note, gently suggested some practical adjustments to my daily workload, and moved on to the rest of the appointment as though nothing significant had happened at all. But something significant had happened, at least inside me. That single question, "Who is helping you?" had cracked open an assumption I did not even know I was carrying. An assumption so deep I had never once identified it as a choice rather than simply the way things were. I drove the 30 miles home that afternoon, turning the question over and over. And what I found, examining it honestly for what felt like the first time, was something uncomfortable. I had absorbed, somewhere across my entire upbringing, the quiet belief that needing help was a kind of weakness, that a truly capable Amish wife simply managed, regardless of circumstance, without complaint and without adjustment. Pregnancy, in the world I had grown up in, was something you carried the same way you carried everything else, silently, independently, without asking anyone to notice the weight of it. I did not say anything to Samuel that evening. I want to be honest about that first response because I think it matters. My instinct, even after that revealing question, was still to simply absorb this new understanding privately rather than actually change anything about how I was living. Old patterns do not release their grip after a single conversation, however meaningful. It was nearly 3 weeks later, after a particularly exhausting day, that I finally said something to Samuel directly. I told him carefully that I had been struggling more than I let on, that the doctor had asked me a question that made me realize I had never once actually asked anyone in our household to adjust anything for me during this pregnancy. Samuel's response surprised me. He was not defensive. He seemed, if anything, quietly troubled that I had been carrying this alone without ever telling him. He told me gently that he had assumed I would tell him directly if something needed to change. The same assumption, I realized, running in the opposite direction, that I had absorbed about not asking at all. I want to ask you something right now. Have you ever discovered that an entire pattern of silent self-sacrifice in your own life was never actually required by anyone around you? That it was simply an assumption you had built and maintained entirely on your own, without anyone ever actually asking it of you? That is exactly what I discovered in that small exam room, 30 miles from home, alone in a paper gown, answering a question I had never once thought to ask myself. Things changed slowly after that, the way real changes usually do. I began cautiously actually naming what I needed: a lighter load on the hardest days, help with the heaviest laundry, small adjustments that Samuel, once he understood, offered without any hesitation at all. I attended my remaining appointments accompanied, some by Samuel when harvest allowed, some by my own mother, no longer treating the entire experience as something to be managed in complete isolation. My daughter was born 8 months later, healthy and strong. And I think about that first appointment often, not as the beginning of any dramatic transformation, but as the quiet moment a simple, kind question from a stranger finally gave me permission to ask something I had never once thought to ask myself. I want to leave you with something before I go tonight. Is there an assumption you are currently carrying, silently and completely on your own, that no one around you has ever actually asked you to carry? Something you assumed was required simply because you had never once stopped to examine whether it actually was? I think about how differently that entire pregnancy might have unfolded if the doctor that day had simply asked her routine questions and moved on without pausing to notice the gap in my answer. I think about how many other quiet assumptions I might still be carrying, entirely unexamined, if that particular stranger had not happened to be paying close enough attention to actually see me that afternoon. I believe that question, however it applies to your own life, is worth sitting with honestly. Mine changed the entire shape of how I moved through the most important physical experience of my life. I hope, whatever your own version of that question turns out to be, you find the same permission I finally found. 30 miles from home, in a small, quiet room, answering a stranger's simple, careful question with the truth for the very first time.